You've seen the survey, at least the headlines from this particular survey. What does it tell you about the role of the U.S. In the world? Whither Pax Americana?
Well, I think we're going to get some pretty interesting insights into that next week in Hamburg, when, of course, President Trump will be there for the G20 G20 summit. But I think what it tells you, obviously, is that at least on the optics, in terms of the diplomatic relations right now between the U.S. and the rest of the world, they are pretty poor. There has been a lot of disappointment, especially in Asia, actually, I would also add, with what people have seen early on, anyway, from the Trump administration. But it's also important to bear in mind that as annoyed as some leaders around the table might be with Donald Trump next week, it is still the most powerful country in the world. And whatever people think about Trump himself as president, they're still going to have to put their differences aside and do business.
And John, good afternoon to you. It was said a lot during the election campaign that given the difficulties President Trump might have in getting policy through the Washington apparatus, and we're seeing that right now, that perhaps he'll have more power to influence the international agenda versus his own domestic agenda. Is that something that perhaps this plays into? He turns his attention maybe internationally.
Well, I think global leaders are all too aware of that, and you're right to point out, of course, a lot of his domestic agenda has run into difficulties. But if you look at where U.S. presidents do have more unfettered power, he certainly has not. He hasn't been frightened to wield that. Of course, there were the attacks in Syria, the missile strikes in Syria, which were generally welcomed by many countries around the world. But if you look at his decision to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, if you look at TPP and how early on his decision came to pull out of the Asian trade agreement, he has been very willing to show the rest of the world that he is a very different president to everything that's gone before. And I think, the G7, we saw Trump being very much isolated around the table. We'll probably see a certain amount of that again at the G20 next week, especially as Chancellor Merkel works very, very hard to try to shore up this new alliance that Germany is forging on a range of issues with China.
And we've